My name is Jillian Davidge. I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programming. So it's my pleasure to welcome you and also to welcome the Newfoundland and Labrador Archaeological Society. They're here as part 2 of a series of lectures that we do in partnership with the Archaeological Society, which for us is fantastic because they provide us with people that are working in the field right now, and we provide them with a theater and an audience. So it's my pleasure to welcome them. I'm going to pass it over to Tim Rast, who is the president of the Newfoundland and Labrador Archaeological Society, and he will introduce our presenters. After I do that, I will close the doors, but they do not lock. So don't worry, if you need to step out, you will be able to get back in. And I will also lower the lights so that we can see the slides. All right, so enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Julian. My name is Tim Rast. I'm the president of the NLAS. The Newfoundland and Labrador Archaeological Society is it's a really new organization. We had our 2nd annual AGM actually in this room last night following the first talk we helped organize this week. Dr. Amanda Crompton was talking about some of her work in the Placentia area, looking at the French history at the Chateau Rouge. Following that, we had our annual general meeting. If you'd like to know more about the NLAS, the sort of talks we organize, the workshops we organize, some of the projects that we have on the go, we'll be here. We have a table set up where memberships are very cheap, and they help support a lot of events like this in the province. It's my pleasure to introduce the 3 speakers today, Christina Robinson, Marc Storey, and Ariel Belsheim. They are members of the Coastal Archaeological Resources Risk Assessment Project, or CARRA. Christina is the project coordinator and research assistant with the project. She has a BSc in archaeology from Bournemouth University and was a professional archaeologist for 11 years in the United Kingdom. She excavated and recorded sites, everything from the Mesolithic to World War II archaeology sites. She completed an MA degree at Memorial University on a project called What Lies Beneath, 3 non-intrusive archaeological surveys to identify Dorset Paleo-Eskimo dwellings at Phillips Garden, Port au Choix, Newfoundland. Marc Storey is a graduate student. He has an undergraduate degree from Carleton University, focusing on archaeology and geology, and 15 years of experience as a professional archaeologist in the UK and Europe. He's currently pursuing a master's degree in geography at Memorial University. The 3rd speaker, Ariel Belsheim, is a graduate student. She's currently in the geography department at MUN. She has an undergraduate degree from the University of Lethbridge, focusing on geography, archaeology, and geographic information systems. And she's worked on sites in Israel, Alberta, and Newfoundland. So there's a lot of experience, a lot of interdisciplinary knowledge that they bring to the project. So I think Christina is speaking first. Yep. So please welcome Christina Robinson.
Right, can everybody hear me? Because my voice doesn't carry very well. No, I have no idea. Is it on?
No.
Is that better? It's not on. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Yay! All right, I'd like to thank Tim and the Newfoundland and Labrador Society, Archaeological Society, for asking us to come and talk here today. So as Tim's already said, we're going to be talking about the CARRA project, which stands for the Coastal Archaeological Resources Risk Assessment Project. And the project is a government and university collaboration, and we have many funders which this project wouldn't be able to do without. So just a quick layout of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about why the CARRA project is happening, how the CARRA project came about, and the layout of the CARRA project, and some of the methods and the preliminary results that we have for this project so far on the work that we've done. So coastal change is happening. Here we have a historic root cellar that's near Placentia, and we can see that it's very close to the edge of the cliff and that it is eroding. But this case is not an isolated case. This is happening around the world. Coastal sites are becoming more susceptible to coastal change due to climate change. And the acceleration of coastal change is making sites more vulnerable. And ultimately, this means that we risk losing our heritage. Now, there are a number of factors that are contributing to coastal change, but CARRA is focusing on sea level change. So again, there are many factors that contribute to sea level change, and we're going to talk about a few of them here today. So global warming, climate change, we've all heard about for the last decade or so. Well, this is adding to the glaciers and ice sheets that are on the land melting, and that water is finding its way down into the oceans. These oceans are then warming up, and this warming expands the water. So then you get a small rise in sea level, but this small rise has disastrous effects when it comes to storm surges. This means that we're going to get larger storm surges. So it means instead of being 1 meter, we're going to get anywhere between 2 and 3 meters increase in storm surge. Not only are we going to get an increase in the size of the storm surge, we're going to get more frequent storm surges. And we're already seeing that here in Newfoundland with the amount of storms that are appearing on our shores. In addition to these factors that I've already mentioned, they all make the sea level rise. There is, however, another aspect of this which can either make the sea level rise or lower. And this is due to the legacy of the last ice age. And here in Canada, we were covered with ice. And you can see just here, there's a tip of Newfoundland just sticking out. We're not all covered, nearly covered. But what happens when the glacier starts to form is the weight of that glacier displaces the earth crust underneath it, and it shifts it out to the edges. So you get a rise on the edge and a depression in the middle. And when that glacier starts to retreat, it all rebounds back, but it's over thousands of years, so it's very, very slow. So depending where you are in that landscape, you're going to have a different effect to the sea level rise. So if you're in the middle and you're in the depression, as it comes back up, you're going to be rising. So you're going to decrease the effects of sea level rise. If you're on the outer edges and you're on the areas that have risen, once that glacier retreats and it lowers, they start to fall, you're going to increase the effects of sea level rise. So what does this all mean for here in Newfoundland and Labrador? So here we can see we have some different predictions for how much the sea level is going to rise. And the reason why they're different is because the glacier edge was here. So this side of the glacier is going to be on that area that bulged out and up. So this land is now falling and submerging, so it's increasing the effects of sea level rise. And then on the other side, you have the opposite that's happening. That land is rising, so now you're decreasing the effects of that sea level rise. So why are we concerned with this? We have the largest coastline here in the world in Canada, and there are many, many sites that are located on the coast. So for example, here in Newfoundland, we have 80% of our sites, both historic and prehistoric, here on the coast. And we already know that these sites are starting to disappear. These have already been hitting our headlines. So this site here is the beaches site in Bonavista Bay. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. And also the province is very much aware of what's happening out there on the coast. So with all that in mind, in 2011, an impact assessment, a vulnerability assessment, was conducted by a postdoctoral candidate at MUN, and he was curious as to what was going to happen to these sites in the future. So they went out and did this research, and it had some really alarming results. They found that 20% of sites in 3 study areas were going to be at risk in the next 10 to 15 years. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this assessment, because it's the basis of the CARRA project. So these are the 3 study sites. So we have Pudashwa, which is on the west coast here of the Northern Peninsula, and Lance Meadow is right at the tip, and Buena Vista Bay on the east coast there. So there are 3 elements that they used to make the risk assessment, the vulnerability assessment, and this one is the Lance Meadows area that they looked at, and the 3 elements that they used was looking at the topography or the landscape, and they were using a digital 3D model for this, and this is what that landscape would have. It's flat now, but it would have looked. This is the area that they covered, and then they flooded that 3D landscape with the sea level rise, and these lines here are the new coastlines that would have been formed with the sea level rise, and they've done this with 3 different phases. So you've got 2025, 2050, and 2100. And the final piece of information that they used for this assessment was putting the site locations from the archaeological database at the Provincial Archaeology Office on, which are these points here. And as you can see, there are different colours. So the high one, which is the red, are ones that are going to be affected by sea level rise by 2025. Your moderate ones are going to be affected by sea level rise in 2100. And your green ones are not going to be affected until after 2100, so it's not really, there's no rush. But while doing this assessment, they actually found that there were some issues with the resolution of the data that they were using. So this is the area we were just looking at, and this is a zoomed in area over here. And one of the issues that they found was that the sites were located not always where they should be. And this isn't because people have been making mistakes. It's because most of them that we were looking at have been recorded prior to GPS. So you're putting a small point on a very large scale map, so you weren't getting the right accuracy. And then the next problem that they found was that the landscape, the 3D digital landscape that they were using wasn't at a really high enough resolution for what they needed. And they found that when they were projecting sea level rise here, that the shoreline wasn't retreating, but it was actually increasing. So it's not really what should be happening when you're flooding a landscape. And also they were getting these strange 90-degree angles that aren't really appearing in nature. So this is where the CARRA project comes in. And what happened is that the university went to the government and they had a meeting with the government. And the government and the university decided that they want to take this further. They wanted to develop a tool that heritage managers could use to plan for the future for sea level rise with these, for heritage resources. So the CARRA project was born. So 2012, the CARRA project was created. And the aims of the CARRA project were as such that they wanted to refine the vulnerability assessment that I've just talked about. And then they wanted to also look at how people prioritize sites once they know that they're at risk. And then they wanted to know, well, what are the options do we have to protect these sites? So those are the main aims of the CARRA project. So now I'm going to talk to you about the layout of the CARRA project and go into a little bit more detail. So for the vulnerability assessment, we covered the same 3 study areas as the previous assessment, so we could make comparisons in what the difference in the data was. And we also added the Strait of Belle Isle, but both on the Newfoundland and Labrador side. And so the stages of the vulnerability assessment don't change from the previous assessment. So we still look at sea level rise, which Marc will talk to you about in a bit more detail. And we're still looking at the topography, the landscape, but we're going to have different resolutions of maps, so bigger scales of resolution. And then also we're looking at the locations of these sites. And what we were doing, we were going out and into the field, which both Marc and Ariel are going to show you some pictures of the sites that we went and visited and what's going on there. The second part, the prioritization. Imagine if you have 10 sites in your study area and 4 of those are at risk. How do you choose which of those 4 sites that you can protect? This is a kind of a tricky subject for heritage managers, as most are mandated to protect everything. And here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we're no different. They have the Historic Resources Act, which says that they need to protect everything. But practically and financially, this isn't something that can happen. So we need to learn to prioritize as a community. So what we've been doing is we've been looking at how people have been prioritizing sites that are at risk, and then we're going to present those options to heritage managers so they can choose what way they want to prioritize those sites. And the third option that we're looking at is what people are doing to protect these sites. So how are they managing them once they know that they're at risk? Are they doing nothing? Are they putting a physical barrier in? Or are they doing rescue or salvage excavation? I'm going to be looking at that in a bit more detail later on. So that's the layout of the CARRA project and what we are going to be doing. I'm now going to hand you to Marc, and he's going to talk to you a bit about the methods of the site vulnerability assessment.
Thank you very much. Is my voice okay? Can everyone hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Hopefully this is the first and last photo of me you'll have to endure. That's sort of my go-to archaeology photos. So as Christina was saying, within the CARRA project, we took that 2011 vulnerability assessment, and as well as being the catalyst for the CARRA project, we also use that as our baseline. And so we're using those same 3 elements: sea level rise, we're using that to flood a digitally created landscape, and then within that we're locating our archaeological sites, and we're refining each of those 3 elements. So to start off, quickly looking at sea level rise. And within the CARRA project, we're using the most recent published data from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's only just come out in the past couple of months. And even since that data has been further refined by Natural Resources Canada to give sort of local changes around, because of course the sea level just doesn't rise and fall. There's no real mean sea level. Sea level in one bay might be slightly different from another one due to different hydrodynamics and factors like that. And so NR Canada has produced a model that sort of takes that into account. So if our current sea level is here, and let's say we have any old landscape, and we have 3 archaeological sites, 3 coastal archaeological sites within that. Our current sea level rise doesn't really affect those 3. With this new sea level model, by 2025 plus a 2-meter storm surge, we are going to start having impacts. So anything that is affected by 2025 within both the 2011 vulnerability assessment and within the CARRA, we consider at high risk. After that, the next category is 2100. So by the end of the millennium, and with this we have a 3-meter storm surge to take into account that we are going to have increased storminess as the coast continues to change due to anthropogenic climate change. So we're increasing the storm surge to 3 meters, and these sites are considered as moderate or moderately at risk. Beyond that, so post 2100, these sites are at low risk. So it's the same sort of classification system that we used in the first vulnerability assessment. So that's the wet side of stuff. So if we look at the the terrain model, so that the topography. The original model used geo-based data. This is the official nationally accredited digital land data that's maintained by the government. So all of your road maps, anything like that is going to be derived from this geo-based data. This is free to download, anyone can access it. So this is sort of the baseline of topographic data for the country, which is what I used earlier. So we're going to be comparing our results using that and testing them against both using community mapping, which is a bespoke survey that's been carried out by trained surveyors in the communities within the province by the government. So most, if not all, large communities in the province have had some sort of community mapping. And this will usually be on a scale of 1 to 2,500, maybe 1 to 5,000 for some areas. And finally, we're going to be looking at LiDAR data, which has been commissioned expressly for this project, and I'll be talking about that now.
Question.
Yeah.
What is LiDAR?
LiDAR stands for light and distance ranging. Effectively, there's an instrument mounted on the underside of a plane that's flying a grid pattern. That instrument will beam out millions of lasers across the land. These are traveling at light speed, bouncing back to this instrument, and based on the time it takes to hit the object and return, they can get an exact elevation for that land, because the plane itself is communicating with both terrestrial GPS and satellite. So the plane knows its location, so millimeter accurate. So it knows exactly where it is in 3D space. So all of the readings that it's taking as it flies over the land is also being recorded, millimeter accurate in 3D space. So by doing that, it's basically digitizing the whole landscape. So creating just a huge wireframe model of our world.
That was your next slide, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay.
And so this, it looks like a photograph that's been draped over top of a landscape model, but this is pure data. This is what is spat out by this sort of instrument. So these look like trees. These are just clusters of points.
The attributes.
Sorry? Well, they represent trees, but they're, when the laser hits a tree, hits a leaf, it will bounce back. And so it actually captures, and because it uses light, it can capture the color of the surface that it's striking as well. And so you can create incredible models using this technology. This is probably represents the apex of sort of digital creation in terms of terrestrial survey. We were lucky enough to be able to commission it for all of our study areas. But also, once it surveys where it's hitting tree, then maybe it's hitting the land beneath that tree, then back to tree. So with the software that we're using, we can say, well, actually those trees, those are anomalous readings. We're just interested in the land. So let's strip out those trees and all the vegetation and all the buildings, birds, telephone cables. Let's get rid of it all. Let's just see what's underneath. And it's this that we're going to flood. It does no good us flooding a model that has buildings in it and trees in it, because we're not going to get a realistic result. So we stripped all that down. So as I say, the LiDAR instrument, we're throwing millions upon millions of points down. So we could be, flooding the area with 100, distinct elevation points per square meter. But then at what point do we stop? Here's a pretty well-known archaeological site in the province, and this has been recorded at 1 point for every 5 meters. Any guesses? As we increase the resolution, this is 9 points per square meter. Any guesses?
Lands Meadows.
It is, and you can actually see the buried archaeology. You see the original longhouse, that's the reconstruction. And again, that's been classified out, so we've just reduced that, but I've left it as a little white block so we can see it. And we have all the other buried north structures.
What did you say was?
Lots of meadows.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and we can see, we have the stream, roads come through, but we can even see some of the detail in the waves, so we can get an understanding of the hydrodynamics within the bay as well. And so this is the resolution that we're really testing our model with. So it is a huge increase from that 150,000 geobase.
Question.
So, yeah,
When you say commissioning LiDAR for this, does that mean some private company owns it or something and you have to buy
it's
these surveys?
an incredibly expensive means of surveying because you need the pilot, airtime, the instruments, the data processing at the end of it. It is becoming more affordable. I know there are some provinces in Canada that are getting full coverage, so the government is actually paying for full coverage. New Brunswick they've covered their province and they've made that available. I think Nova Scotia is doing the same, PEI is doing the same. We're lagging a little bit, but hopefully, we'll be able to produce sort of maps from now on with this level of resolution. So a quick example, and we're sort of throwing together all of these different elements now: the sea level rise, topographic survey, and the location of the archaeological sites. We have the Spence site, which is out at Port au Choix, and you can sort of see the coastal context. We're 100 yards or so away from the active coast, though we do have a bit of infrastructure between us and there. This is a Paleo-Eskimo and a recent Indian site. So at our 3 different levels of resolution, and again, we're using that high, moderate, and low key. So this red, this is using the geobase, so this is the lowest resolution that we're using within. So you can see the red all represents what is at risk by 2025. It's a huge bits of the community, according to this resolution, are actually at risk. Within that, as Christina's already said, the location of the archaeological site is not always exact, and this is the case with this one as well. So we actually have the location of the site as recorded within the provincial database out to sea. So we've gone in and we've mapped the real location, but regardless, this site is considered at high risk when we use this resolution. At the community mapping scale, which is a huge refinement, the location of the site according to the provincial database doesn't change, nor does ours. But the sea level, how that interacts with our 3D constructed landscape model changes wildly. So we don't have this huge inundation in the middle of Port au Choix. Instead, all of this is now considered low, which means it's probably not going to be impacted, and if it does, it won't be until the next century. Lastly, we have our LiDAR model, which you might be able to see on here. Like the community mapping, the edge is much more precise. You can actually see all the bits of infrastructure, all the wharves and the current fishing plans. They've all been sort of taken into account by this. And our sites still don't change, but the way that the inundation reacts or interacts with our 3D landscape does change dramatically. So this is sort of what we're looking for, and we're testing this for every site that we do. And this is sort of everything that we're doing within the office. CARRA is largely a desk-based assessment. So 90% of the stuff we're doing, we're hunched in front of computers, slaving away. But occasionally, we're let out of our cage, and we can go out to the field. So I had 3 sites, which three of the 4 that Christina talked about earlier. So Port au Choix, Strait of Belle-Isle, and Lossa Meadow. So we'll go through each of those, and I'll show you some more examples of what we were recording when we were out in the field. So at Port au Choix, the landscape, I'm sure for those who have been out there, it's Marc. We have some very sort of rocky cliffs, and we have some very low-lying coastal plains in the back. Within the study area we had at Port au Choix, we had 46 archaeological sites that we went and revisited. And again, most archaeological sites are just marked by a point on a map. But of course, in a vulnerability assessment, that doesn't do any good, a point on a map. If you were to put your finger on top of the map and wait for the water to rush in, by the time your fingertip got wet, half your site would be washed away. And so we really have to know the full extent of the archaeological property which we're dealing with. And again, below, Our site is about 800 meters away from the photographer in this image, but the site extents itself are right up to our feet, if not beyond. You might be able to see there's some cobbles in here. That's an old French galley where they would have dried their swamp cod. So at the Strait of Belsheim, we had a whopping 107 sites that we went to visit, and most of those were predominantly within these really sandy pocket beaches that we had. So a slightly different sort of environment to what we were looking at Porto. And as well as getting a good idea of the extent of our archaeological site, we also wanted to look at what sites out there were actually currently at risk. The PAO, the provincial archaeologists in this province, does a fantastic job, but they can't be everywhere. And so while we were out getting our boots wet, we went out and we actually surveyed these. So we were looking at things like high tide. If there was an archaeological site that was already being inundated by high tide, obviously that was currently eroding, and it is actually at risk. Similarly, if there's a site that's currently within of sort of seaward of the extent of driftwood, which represents the storm surge. So those almighty waves that will pummel the coast and just deliver driftwood quite far inland. In some cases, this is the Lansamore site. We had driftwood 110 meters inland. So any archaeological site between that line and the coast is actively eroding. It is at very high risk. As we went through and we made a note of all of these. And then at Lossa Meadow, where we looked at 36 archaeological sites, we looked at things like the vegetation line, and these aren't specific to these sites. We looked at the vegetation line everywhere. We made a survey of the seaweed line and the driftwood line at all of our sites. We got a really good understanding of all the geological, geomorphological changes that were going on at the site. So this vegetation line, of course, where you get vegetation, the roots are a bit more tenacious and they hold that soil, so it's a bit slower to erode. And so this is where you get most of the erosion scarring that we see when we're out on the coast, at that vegetation line. Similarly, we went through and we surveyed in the tree line. So this is sort of the last defense of coastal erosion. Very little erosion will happen where the tree roots have gone in and they've really solidified the soils underneath it. That's very resilient to inundation. So again, at Porto, of those 46 sites that we went to visit, 7 of those were actively eroding. This is a historic bird blind that you should be able to see, and that is being battered by the driftwood that's constantly being rolled and pitched up over the top of it, and several courses have already been destroyed that way. At Strait of Belsheim, this is a historic cemetery that's almost being undercut by wave activity that's just eating away at the sand dune on top of which it was built. It might not be too long before we have the issue of exposed human remains in this area. In the Strait of Belsheim, I think 8% of our sites were actively eroding. And at Lossa Meadow, we have a small erosion scar there. And while it seems quite a distance away from the actual buried Norse archaeology, which are these 2 small mounds at the back, this whole beach in front of it is just littered with Paleo-Eskimo and Maritime Archaic and recent Indian archaeological sites as well. And because it's a World Heritage Site, and because nearly 1 in 3 archaeological sites within this area are actively eroding, this sort of demonstrates how timely and how urgent this sort of research is, and how important it is to actually get our boots on the ground and get our feet wet and go and investigate these sites. We can do all the desk-based assessments, sat in our office looking at these things, coming up with results, but unless we get ourselves out in the field, we won't get a real idea of what's happening right now. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to Ariel, who will put all of this in context of one of her study areas.
All right, so now I get the pretty picture part of the presentation, so don't worry. So as Marc said, he had 3 study areas, Lossa Meadows, Porto, and Strait of Belsheim. You might be thinking why I only got 1, but I did the Bonavista Bay area, and it's approximately 1,900 square kilometers. So I spent 6 weeks this summer with Marc and my mother actually, surveying in the Bonavista Vista Bay study area, and we were able to get to 60 of the 114 sites that are in the database for this area. And we only got to 60 because we had really lousy weather in August, and it's a very difficult place to get out to. So I'm going to tell you a bit about why Bonavista Vista Bay. Because as Christina talked about earlier, we talked about sea level rise and isostatic rebound and different types of coastlines. Well, Bonavista Vista Bay is the pinnacle of all of this. We have, first, we have a submerging landscape. So that the glaciers move through. This landscape is not only sinking and sea level is rising, we have problems with the type of coastline it is as well. So this bedrock coastline here is very steep, but there's not a lot of offshore shoaling. And so that means that when the waves come in, they break right along our coastal archaeology. They break on our coastal archaeology, diminishing all their energy right there. So this just exacerbates erosion. We also have a bit of a mixed topography in the sense that, as you can see up here, we do have offshore islands, which in some cases help to diminish that wave energy and protect our coastal archaeology. But in other ways, such as in the Bloody Reach, which is back here, the wind just funnels right through there. And so you get extreme waves, extreme storms, and very heavy erosion in some areas where just next door, the cove next door may have nothing. And as you can see, even in this image, there's not much protecting this site. So there's a large fetch, which is a large area for wind to propagate the waves across and make them larger. The other interesting thing about the Bonavista Vista Bay study area is that we have a different type of archaeology. So down here you can see cut slabs from a sawmill that was in Terra Nova National Park. So you're no longer worrying about flakes eroding out of a bank, but you're thinking about submerging artifacts and rusting artifacts because you have all the sawmill pieces. And what do you do about that, if anything? So as I was saying, we made it to 60 out of the 114 sites, and of those 60 sites, 40 or 67% were actively eroding. So that's quite a bit. And I'm going to show you some of these sites and some of the things I found while I was out there. So this is the first site. It's the moss site there. And this site is on a bedrock coastline, so it's not actively, the first thing that the waves hit is not the sediment, it's the bedrock. But that doesn't necessarily stop it. Because it's a shallow bedrock coastline, the waves run up and erode this peat substrate. So you can see here, we didn't place these, we actually found it like this. You can ask Lauren McLean. You can see here that these flakes are eroding out of this site. And there's so many sites in this area, it's hard to actively monitor them every year and get out and collect all of this. And so this is a problem. The site hasn't been visited in many years, and we go back and we found more than just this. We found handfuls and handfuls of flakes just spread through the intertidal zone. And every time that tide comes in, those flakes leave. This is another great example of this. This is the Bloody Bay Cove 1 site, which was excavated in the early 1970s, but there was so many flakes, so many flakes that the excavators decided to leave them because they're not diagnostic. So when Marc and I returned here, the whole thing was scattered with flakes, and it's a very shallow bedrock coastline, and the waves just come right up on top of what's probably about 1.5 inches of substrate or sediment. And even in the intertidal zone here, you can see my boot, and you can see this small, what maybe a preform, just sitting in there. And if you get enough storm activity, that's going to come out of the intertidal zone and into a very deep cove where it won't be found again, unless somebody decides to dive with the jellies. Again, to go to another site, this further south, is the sawmilling component. I know there's a lot of sawmill sites in Terra Nova National Park, and the communities surrounding are very interested in this. This is their history. This is what their grandparents are a part of and what they understand. And we see a lot of this, a lot of tidally submerged sawmilling sites. So this is actually when the tide's going out. And when we originally got there, it was high tide, and the water was like almost up to our hips. It was so high that we had to wait for the tide to go out to even survey this site. And although this is vegetated, it's not protecting because the water just submerges in that grass and just sinks in behind it. And it continuously, like, luckily with our current conditions of water, the cold is helping preserve it. But with that rising sea level, that increased warmth in water temperature, you're gonna have to face the fact that some of these sites are gonna be gone and they're gonna start eroding. Another really great part about being able to get our boots on the ground, besides seeing whether or not they're eroding, is what's the environment out in some of these areas. We can speculate, we can assume, we can look at things, but until you really get out there, you don't know what's going on. And the other hard part about that is even when you're out there on a great day. Like, you're not going out in the boat in the middle of a hurricane, so you don't get to see the types of coastal hazards that these sites are facing. And so things like this, a tree fall, is great for us. It really shows us what's going on. And you can see down here that there's a large fetch here. There are some offshore, well, not offshore, this is the shore, but there are some protective structures here, but not to the same extent. And in order to make a tree fall over like that, substrate intact, that means that the wind and the waves are coming in at such a magnificent force that it's able to rip it right out and throw it over. And the other great thing, as archaeologists, a tree fall always lets us look for things that would have been buried. And if we're not allowed to dig, that's great. So here, the site, no one knew if it still existed. No one knew if there were any artifacts left or any remnants of the site left because nobody had made a permit to dig out there. And so I just looked in the tree fall and I found a bunch of flakes sitting in there. So just here's one. But it allows us to get an idea of what's left. Is there something left? So this is the bank site, another yet eroding site in our study area. And this is really important site in the Terra National Park because it has some of the longest history for them, ranging from the Maritime Archaic right up to the recent Indian. And it contains tons and tons and tons and tons of artifacts. I cannot stress how many they pull out of here. And even when I was there, Jenith, I had talked to her earlier, she said, you're gonna find flakes. Only pick it up if it's like the pinnacle of all archaeology in Newfoundland, because there's so much stuff coming out of this bank every year. And this is an interesting site because it even has that shoaling, it even has offshore protection, but the amount of energy that's in these sounds is just eroding it. And so you can see some of the flakes that one of the Parks Canada workers picked up there. So being able to get our boots on the ground not only told us that the sites are eroding, but told us kind of what can you find there, what's left of these sites, and what types of things are we trying to protect? And what's the environment like? Is it something that we can try and protect, or is it basically sitting out there in the middle of the ocean waiting to be destroyed? Another really interesting part of the Bonavista Bay study area is the governing agencies. So Christina mentioned to you that Newfoundland and Labrador is governed to protect all of the sites within the province. They are mandated to make sure everybody's safe and everything's being saved. However, I also have a second governing agency in Bonavista Bay, which is Parks Canada. And they just recently redid their cultural resource management plan that no longer mandates them to protect every site within the park, but only what sites they're able to protect. So this kind of takes a broader approach at it. It no longer gives them the pressure that everything has to be looked at, everything has to be protected. They do what they can with what they have when they can. And this is the second time this image has shown up. So a little anecdote about our field study, or our study time. This was I don't know, it's almost a foot long. It went from my elbow to my arm, my wrist. And it's got working on this side and a little bit on this side, and Marc pulled it out of an eroding bank. He saw it just hanging there. And so one big storm, and we would have never seen this thing. And we still have no idea what it is, but it's very interesting. So the next step in our project is to prioritize or figure out how are we going to prioritize, right? And as Christina mentioned, this is really hard. When you're supposed to be protecting everything, how are you to decide that Lansdowne Meadows is more important than a pile of flakes in Terra Nova? What makes one site more important than another, or is there something that does? So we've been looking into the literature to see how other people are doing it, and we've come up with a few of the main ways. So, cultural significance. What does it mean to the Newfoundland culture? What does it mean to our history? So L'Anse aux Meadows is very important because it's the Norse, and they're coming to the island. And then you have the beaches site, which was the oldest site in Newfoundland for a long time. And so these kind of things, they make them culturally significant, but how do you just choose between L'Anse aux Meadows and the beaches site? So then we also look at socioeconomic factors. So which one's bringing in tourism, which one's helping the communities, which ones are the communities invested in? And then the CARRA project and our vulnerability assessment, when are they going to be at risk? So maybe L'Anse aux Meadows won't be at risk for another 50 years where the beaches is almost gone as it is. So that's a factor that you have to take into account. And then we have our boots on the ground, our current condition. What's happening there now? Is something happening there now? So we really have to look into what's going on with the site, what does it mean? And I know for Parks Canada particularly, they really look at what does the community want. If Charlottetown really wants to have a sawmill site saved over a recent Indian or a maritime archaic site, then that's their prerogative. And they take that into account in their assessments of priority. So the next step for us is to look at, once you've prioritized, once you've chosen these sites, what are you going to do? Well, how do you protect them? And what are your methods? So I'll leave you with Christina to talk a little more about that.
I do have one question before you go.
Sure.
You talked about flakes several times. Do you mean potential fossils? Is that what flakes are?
Sorry, I'm going to wiggle back here. That's a flake. So when you have a stone and they're making an artifact out of it, there's always the extra stuff. Does that make any sense? I'm sure Tim Raz could explain it far better, but when you hit the rock, there's little pieces that come off, and they're called flakes, before you actually get the real nice thing, or the real nice flake that you then make a nice point out of.
Thank you.
Don't try this backpack.
It's not.
So, like Ariel said, you've now got those sites that you want to protect. How are we going to protect them? So I'm going to talk about some of the options that we have as heritage managers to protect sites. And we're looking at both successes and failures so that we can see what works and what doesn't. So one of the methods that we're looking at is monitoring and recording. Now, in Europe, they are doing lots and lots of monitoring, and they're using huge volunteer groups to go out and do this. And they're creating apps for smartphones for people to go out and do this, and it's becoming really huge, the monitoring aspect of this. We're not quite there yet in Canada, but in New Brunswick, I know that they have a monitoring and recording program that's been going for several years. And Nova Scotia, they have just started a monitoring program with the Coast Guard. And in PEI, I know that they have a vulnerability assessment in play, but I'm not sure what they're doing for their next step. So we're getting there. We just need to do a few more runs and we'll be there with Europe and have our volunteer groups going out there and looking at these sites. The next option is recording, preserving by recording. Now, we do this as archaeologists anyway, but what they're suggesting is that you don't actually go out and excavate any of this. You just go out and you photograph and record these sites as they are. So here we have a 3D image that they've created from photographs of a megalithic tomb in Europe that is eroding out of the bank. So what they do is they'll go and record it once, they'll go away for 6 months, they come back in 6 months, and you see what it's like, and they record it again. So these are some of the options that you could be doing, and then that's how it's recorded, and you don't do anything else with it. Your next lot of options is actual physical protection. So here, these are all a bit closer to home. So this one here is a gabion wall that has been built on Inspector Island. And when I say gabion wall, all it is stones wrapped in chicken wire. And this was put in place by Ralph Pastore 27 years ago. It's still protecting the site. He did that off his own back. He didn't have any input, but it has worked. And then you have this one on the end here, which is another Gabion wall, and this is on Minister Island in New Brunswick. They had a bit more help. They had a civil engineer that came out and told them what materials to use, what protection to use. And again, it's been successful, and it's still protecting the site today. And that's been there for like the last 20, 25 years. So they're doing a good job. But then there are areas where they have tried to protect sites, and it's just not worked. And it's no through fault of whoever's trying to do this. And we have an example here of one out at the Beaches site in Bonavista Bay. And the Heritage Foundation, the Burnside Heritage Foundation and Laura McLean have done the best they can with the funds that they've had and the material that they can get out to this site. It's a remote location, so they can't get lots of stone out there. So they've been taking wood out there and building these protections. Now, it did last for a few years, and it did protect the site for a little while, and then it failed. It got beaten up by storms and sea ice, and it failed. So they built another one behind it, and that protected the site for a little while. But again, the storms have come in, the sea ice has come in, and it's destroyed it again. So the site is again eroding. So what we get from this, just these few examples, is that we really need to know our environment as to what sort of protection we're going to use. So next we're going to look at something that's a little bit more costly. This is a Neolithic site in Scarborough, Scotland. And this is an internationally important site in Scotland. And they get tens of thousands of visitors every year to this site, and it brings in lots and lots of money to the community. And they thought it was that important that they needed to protect it. So they built this big seawall. It cost them millions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars. And with that initial cost, there are still additional costs with the maintenance of it every year. But the revenue that comes in with those tourists has made it worth it. So that's the other thing you've got to think about, is the cost of these protections. Another example of a really costly way of looking at defending this heritage is actually moving the heritage, picking up, putting it down somewhere else and rebuilding it. So this is Herschel Island, and you can see that the coastline has been eroding away. This is the original location of one of the buildings, and they've actually moved this building twice to here. And this method is usually used for built heritage rather than stuff that's buried underneath. But again, it's another option that heritage managers can look at. And we can just have a quick look here. This is why they moved this building, and this is how they moved it on this raft, and they've moved it away from the shoreline. But again, another costly way of doing things. So the last thing that we're looking at here today is rescue or salvage excavation. So this is a site in PEI, and as you can see, it's right on the coast, and it had started eroding in 2001. They started excavations in 2007, all the way through to 2011. And we can see why they wanted to protect it. This is in 2010. So this area here is this area that they're all sat in and excavating there. So by 2010, that's already fallen into the sea. That's gone. This is why we're doing this. We need to start protecting and planning and looking after our heritage. Otherwise, it's just going to go. It's not finite. So just to wrap up the CARRA project, we have done the vulnerabilities. We've been doing the vulnerability assessment and seeing what's going to happen in the future for these sites. And then we're looking at how people are prioritizing these sites. What are the options in prioritizing these sites? We're not going out and telling people how to prioritize them. We're just giving them the options, how to do this. And then lastly, we're getting case studies together to show people what works and what doesn't work and what they need to be focusing on when they're thinking about these sorts of protection. And finally, we're going to communicate all of this to people. And we're doing this through the CARRA webpage, and this is the address here. And we try and update the news feed on a regular basis of what we're doing. We're also going to publish all our results through this webpage. We also have a Facebook page if you want to come and find us, and it's a bit more fun on there with lots more photos on there. And also we're going to be looking at doing lots more presentations and conferences to get our results out there and to get our voice heard. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today, for us letting us talk to you. And if you have any questions, please ask. Yes? Oh, yes.
I was just going to ask that there's obviously some sites that are protected areas that you're not allowed to dig in. Are you prioritizing those sites and seeing the correlation between rate of erosion? So if there's an increased rate of erosion, you're going to have more exposure to your heritage and your sites. Is anyone recording those sites and maybe going back more frequently to see what sort of data you can collect from these sites where natural forces are excavating rather than...
Not currently. It's, oh, go for it, sorry.
I'm going to actually want to be told where there are lots of fossils and that stuff.
I'm just going to answer this part in terms of Terra Nova, because Jenna Curtis, the archaeologist for Terra Nova National Park, she does have a set amount of monitoring sites that she goes and visits every time the park pays for her to come. And she actually has been using, she looks at what, even just sending out park rangers and teaching them what a flake looks like to go look at these sites. And so every time there's a big storm event, they go out and they kind of check. So they're not so much looking for fossils per se, but they are looking for these lithic artifacts or buried sawmilling pieces, etc. And so they're very aware of what's going on. And even after Hurricane Igor, Jenna talks a lot about how Hurricane Igor showed her so much about the park she never knew.
Okay. So yeah, I guess what I'm pointing out is like natural erosion as a beneficial tool.
2 point, yeah. It just depends. Yeah, it depends on which way you're looking at it, right? So you can see it. It's great, like that tree fall, but it's also bad because you're losing that information, right? So we don't know what else is there.
Like most things, like natural erosion, it's sort of a double-edged sword in a way. Like climate change. That image of Skara Brae, the Neolithic village that we had up, that was originally discovered simply because it was once covered by a massive sand dune. They had a huge storm event. That sand dune was shifted. And lo and behold, we have the most intact Neolithic village in all of Europe. Wow. If it wasn't for that storm and for that bit of coastal erosion, that community might be dead. Like people on those islands might have shifted back, but now that's exposed new sources of revenue, new industry, and that's a thriving little community now, all because of that one fluke storm event. And so we do find occasions like that every now and then.
I'm going to ask this more to Marc because it was part of his presentation, but I was under the impression, so what are you doing with LiDAR that's capturing waves and not penetrating waves and seeing the seafloor?
LiDAR, there's multiple different types of LiDAR. It really depends upon the intensity of that laser pulse that you're sending down. There are what's known as hybrid or bathymetric LiDAR that works best underneath the sea. So there are LiDAR units that you can go and equip vessels with, and the Canadian Hydrographic Service uses those to go and chart the sea floor. But even then, because it is light and light does scatter underwater, even those only penetrate to a certain depth. And we did get a little bit of sort of subsurface penetration with ours, but probably no more than a foot, simply because that wasn't the purpose of that equipment that we got. It was primarily to do terrestrial survey. Had we wanted to do both the terrestrial and the subsurface, it would have been exponentially more expensive for us to do that, and the project just couldn't source it. And to be honest, once we get so far up from the coast, it doesn't really have that much relevance to the project. We're not doing really elaborate sea modeling and how deep waters come up. We're not really looking at the deep water processing, and so it's a bit extravagant that we didn't really need.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Have you been to Chapel's Cove? It's
No.
just an hour away from here. I was just curious because we were there yesterday and when you're driving in off the road, like there's a pond or sort of wetland,
Mhm.
and then they look like they have a man-made causeway to get to the other side, and there's the ocean there. And it's like it's washing up, and it's really packed. I'm just wondering, is that man-made or is it there for a
a lot of those
reason?
causeways, they probably started off as little sandbars that existed between sort of, you know,
Yeah,
the
because there's
mainland.
houses on the other
Yeah,
side.
and then someone would have come along, and maybe those were just exposed at low tide, and people would have used them then. And then, you know, over generations, people would just come out and, you know, put some hardcore stone down on it, and just so that it became exposed, you know, throughout all the tidal sequences. And then, you know, infrastructure came along, you dump a road on top of it, and that's how a lot of these long causeways that you get, especially within Terra Nova and Bonavista Bay, you have loads of these roads that are just built upon all of these.
So it's almost like to get to the other side rather than going down the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because there's a really long way getting to the other side if you didn't have that there.
Yeah.
Is that the reason?
Yeah.
Just curious.
I was just curious, that slide you showed with the ice sheets, that the Avalon Peninsula, I mean, maybe
Yeah.
some of the rest was shown not under the glacier.
Yeah.
We have been glaciated here, you have been not.
Part of Newfoundland has, but the effects of the glacier are felt throughout the whole of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's just the different sides of the glacier. So you've got the effects of where the glacier's footprint was and where the glacier has pushed out the material to the side.
And that was, of course, just the sort of predicted extent of the most recent glacier as well. There have been several massive glacier events.
Because I know up around Holyrood, for example, that real desolate place, you see all these big, but I don't, all glacial erratics, so I thought for
Yeah.
sure that
Yeah,
was
it's
glaciated.
just from the last
The last.
The last glaciation.
last ice age.
All right, well, thank you very much. I will open the doors now, so people can leave if they would like. But I'm sure Marc and Christina and Ariel will be around to answer some questions, or Tim, if you have some more questions about the Newfoundland Labrador Archaeological Society, NLAS. Let's get that. Thank you very much. Great.